Good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is the third lecture in the Conservation Department's 2023 Spring Environmental Lecture Series. We have a number of public programs coming up in June, so please check out our social media or our town website for how you can stay involved. Also, we encourage everyone to sign up for the Greenwich Sustainability newsletter, which is, there's a link in the chat to receive more information on upcoming sustainability events. We also want to thank our COSCOP Library for hosting the Zoom webinar tonight and being a wonderful conservation partner to work with. A few housekeeping items. The program will be about 40 minutes with about 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A or the chat functions. Oh, I'm seeing only the chat and Q&A functions located at the bottom of the screen. The webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on the town website as well as the COSCOB Library YouTube page. Look out for a follow-up email, which will include the recording and additional resources. Tonight's discussion is focused on environmental justice and energy equity. This is an important topic to us here in Greenwich. One thing that we're doing right now is writing an executive summary for the climate resiliency plan, and that will look at climate concerns of our residents and town officials and how do we mitigate and adapt to those issues. More so, we're looking at ways to improve the health, safety, and resilience of our communities. We want to ensure that our residents have access to clean air, water, land, and energy. We're fortunate to have Brenda Watson here tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Watson. Brenda Watson is the Executive Director of Operation Fuel, a statewide nonprofit headquartered in Hartford, Connecticut. Operation Fuel partners with communities, businesses, and government to ensure people in need have access to year-round affordable energy and water. Ms. Watson serves on the National Energy and Utility Affordability Coalition as Board Secretary, the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, Water Planning Commission Advisory Group. She is the chair of the Low Income Energy Advisory Board and recently served on Governor Ned Lamont's Transition Committee for Energy Policy. Ms. Watson has a bachelor's degree in political science and public administration from Florida Memorial University and a master's in public policy from Trinity College. Brenda, we're so fortunate to have you and so grateful. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I want to thank the folks at Greenwich Library, COSCOB Library, and the town of Greenwich for inviting me to speak today. It really is indeed a pleasure for me to be here. I did want to briefly touch on environmental justice as a way to launch into energy equity, as there are many entry points to address climate change where environmental justice, energy equity, recycling, urban farming, equitable transportation, housing, and workforce development are all pathways to a just energy transition, a cleaner climate, and healthier communities. I believe that we can't effectively act on climate without the inclusion of all that makes us whole and what makes our communities thrive. Operation Fuel's founding is rooted in helping people who cannot be supported by state and federal programs due to eligibility guidelines. We help people stay safe and healthy in their homes via direct bill payment on their behalf to their utility, water companies, and fuel vendors. We have since evolved and are now engaging in work to understand the barriers that our service population faces as it relates to the adoption of clean, renewable energy products, such as solar, energy storage, and heat pumps, just to name a few. We are working to subsidize the cost of removing health and safety barriers that exist in homes. In Connecticut, as we know, about 25% of our housing stock in our larger cities predate the 1960s, and nearly 30% of those homes in the weatherization pipeline cannot be weatherized due to the health and safety barriers that exist. So I'm excited to be here to talk about energy equity and the work that we do at Operation Fuel. And I'm proud to represent an organization that works to center its service population in the energy transition. Trying to advance here. So the discussion flow will start with a quick examination on what environmental justice is and its connection to energy equity. I will then provide a brief introduction of Operation Fuel's mission and the health and economic implications of our work. From there, I'll discuss how energy equity is an evolving area of study and advocacy. Keep in mind that as our energy sector evolves, I believe our organization should work to evolve and keep up with the times. It's how we better serve those in need. And if time allows, I would like to use it to shine a light on others in the energy and environment community who are the boots on the ground, working to build awareness of the environment and health connection, and working to build a prepared workforce to decarbonize our communities. I don't believe that we will ever achieve our climate goals if we don't include and support our most vulnerable and the low and moderate income populations who happen to also be more likely living a greener lifestyle than those with access to more resources. So it's important to me to amplify those who birthed the environmental justice movement. The photo on the far left is a photo of Dolly Burwell. In the center, we have a photo of Dr. Robert Ballard, who are both regarded as the mother and father of environmental justice. The black and white photo on the far right is the same photo that I have on my cover slide as a reminder of the fact that Black children throughout American history marched with their parents and community against many injustices, including environmental. Burwell herself was arrested 5 times during the PCB protests in Warren County, North Carolina, including her 8-year-old daughter who was arrested while participating in those marches. And I just want to point out that those marches took place over the course of 4 years in 1978 through 1982. So can you imagine that in many of our lifetimes, 8-year-old children were being arrested at an environmental justice protest? It's really quite astonishing to think about. So there have been some in the energy sector that make the reference that America is private sector led and government enabled. It's a comment that resonates with me in a way that reinforces how these two sectors have sadly worked in tandem to cause Black and Brown communities decades of harm. Communities of color were targets for the siting of hazardous facilities and the dumping of hazardous waste. And one notable case that launched the environmental justice movement was the landmark PCB landfill protest in 1982, led by leaders like Ms. Dolly Burwell. Community residents, civil rights leaders, and environmental activists came together to fight state plans to relocate 60,000 tons of carcinogen-laced soil to the majority Black community of Afton, North Carolina. This four-year battle sadly ended with the state, mind you, I just said the state, dumping 7,000 truckloads of contaminated soil in that community. Can't even imagine the image of that, 7,000 truckloads. The term environmental the term environmental racism was coined as a result of the PCB protest. Several years later, in 1994, President Clinton issued an executive order to address environmental justice, ensuring that low-income citizens and communities of color do not suffer a disproportionate burden of industrial pollution, making environmental justice a part of federal policy. And just as recently as last month, President Biden signed an executive order to further embed environmental justice into the work of federal agencies, bring clean energy and healthy environments to all, and mitigate harm to those who have suffered from toxic pollution and other environmental burdens like climate change. So environmental racism is a product of racism. The legacy of redlining and blockbusting Black and Brown communities into communities that received very little to no investment happened up until today, up to 60.
Brenda, are you still there with us? I think we lost you a little bit.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I think you cut out for a little bit there.
Oh, no.
Can you
I'm
just
sorry.
maybe just repeat the last 30 seconds?
Sure. Environmental racism is a product of racism.
Perfect. Yep.
Starting from there?
Yep.
Okay, so the legacy of redlining and blockbusting Black and Brown citizens into communities that receive very little to no investment is a product of environmental racism. Today, up to according to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, your zip code is more important than your genetic code. Are you still hearing me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good.
It cut out just a little bit, but I think it hopefully will be okay.
Okay. So again, your zip code is more important than your genetic code, according to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. So we just ended a weird winter season. It barely snowed, and in April, we were faced with 90-degree days. If you live in a densely populated community like Hartford or Bridgeport, you not only have heat island effects as a result of fewer trees and more concrete or blacktop, but you also have fewer options for safety in high-degree days as a result of poor investment. So that is the legacy of redlining and blockbusting. We've all been sold on the idea that if you magically pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is physically impossible, you'll achieve the American dream. However, this is not true for all Black Americans. In a 2017 report published by the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force, that report showed that 75% of Black Americans are more likely than other Americans to live in communities situated near hazardous waste facilities. Shortly after college, I just want to share this story really quick. I lived in Bridgeport. I worked as a preschool teacher for all of 2 weeks. I could only last that long because the school happened to be located in a housing development, which was adjacent to an incinerator. And depending on which direction the wind blew, the smell would invade our classroom. And I would get sick. Unfortunately, the children, babies, ages 3 to 6, were so used to it, it didn't bother them. Unfortunately, I had to quit. I left that school behind in my rearview mirror, and to this day, I think about the health and well-being of those children who are adults now. It was 25 years ago, and I wonder how many of them have asthma, how many of them have underlying heart conditions, and I'm hoping that they're all well and thriving. John Oliver ran a piece on his show about environmental justice. It's something that I believe is worth Googling. If you just type in John Oliver last week tonight, racism, environmental justice, you'll find it. He notes in that show that racism is one of the few things in this country more powerful than money. It's a powerful statement. And when said out loud by someone like John Oliver, it really is an ally moment in that he used his platform to speak truth to power. And that moment was really significant for someone like me because I felt acknowledged, I felt seen by a gentleman who has a television show and decided to use his platform for good. So thank you to Mr. Oliver for that. I just want to pause here and ask if my sound is okay.
Sounds great, Brenda.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I just want to touch on some solutions for folks who are interested in taking more action. I know that typically the call to action is at the end of these presentations, but I wanted to sprinkle that in right now. I highly recommend that if you're engaged with or in a white-led environmental group, please consider fully embracing the principles of environmental justice. How can you not if your mission is to act on climate? I think lending your support and resources to environmental justice policy on a legislative level, engaging in the rate-making process at the regulatory level to support affordable utility rates, even something like electric vehicle rebates for lower income consumers are ways in which you can lend your voice and power to communities who've suffered the most. And sadly, some longtime established organizations who are also well-funded have inadvertently caused harm to Black and Brown communities by simply not intervening when hazardous waste is spilled in one community and dumped in a Black community. In John Oliver's segment on environmental justice, he actually speaks about that. There's an example in Pennsylvania where there was a massive spill in a mostly white community, and the state spent time and effort to dump that waste in a Black community 100 miles away. And I have to wonder what would have happened if groups that had power and resources rallied around that Black community to prevent that from happening. So, I mean, if there's waste that's not good enough to be housed in a white community, why would it be good enough to be housed in a Black community? So, if you're a supporter of an organization focused on environmental issues, challenge the thinking of those boards of directors or the organization's leaders. I find that some are afraid of how donors will respond, but I find that most see the value in embracing environmental justice. The other piece that I want to highlight or call out is social media activism. There are a lot of online groups sourced by fossil fuel organizations who are spreading misinformation. If you do a search on Facebook, many will pop up from anti-solar groups to anti-wind power groups. And I'm not an expert in social media warfare, but if we had to work, but it's just another example of how we have to work that much harder to educate and share the truth about clean, renewable energy and make the truth dominant on social media. Even on a regulatory side, in other parts of the country, utility companies have waged war against regulators who want to investigate utility rates and how they charge customers. Note that some of these companies do this with paid media. So when you read a story about how great a utility company is and how bad a regulator is, you might want to learn for yourself if that coverage is true or not. And if you're someone who spends a lot of time on social media, use that power for good and push back with the correct and true information about clean and renewable energy, and push back on some of these groups that are spreading misinformation. I just wanted to show a photo of the Operation Fuel team. This is the cover art for our fiscal year 22 annual report. I thought that was just a fun photo to share, but also wanted to highlight how great of a team we have at Operation Fuel. So we were established as a temporary fuel heating program intended to help families who were struggling with the price of fuel. Due to the oil embargo in the late 70s, Governor Ella Grasso worked with the utility and banking industries and the religious community to start a temporary fund to help people get through the winter. Nearly 50 years later, we are still here. Fun fact about former Governor Ella Grasso, she campaigned on utility transparency as a result of one utility company overcharging customers, which at the time regulators knew about. So she reformed the regulating body, which became the Department of Utility Control, aka DPUC, which is now the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, also known as PURA. So Operation Fuel evolved to expand our programs per the demand. Just more people seeking assistance who are struggling with the cost of energy. Connecticut has the highest energy rates in the country. and we're in the top 5. Hawaii is the first country, first state with the highest energy rates. But we provide assistance for all home energy sources, which include electric, gas, all deliverable fuels, and water. We have begun to research, we actually began to research energy affordability in 2007 through 2017 with the help of economist Roger Colton. And we are in the process of finalizing a new study on energy, water, and transportation affordability in Connecticut. And I would love to come back and focus on the results of that study. We are helping the Connecticut Green Bank understand, excuse me, low and moderate income ratepayer attitudes and knowledge about clean and renewable energy products and their barriers to adoption, with a focus on backup power, also known as energy storage. We're also engaged in a project with the Connecticut Green Bank, Yale, and the Clean Energy Group, sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, to understand the needs of ratepayers living in affordable housing who rely on home medical devices and the need for climate-smart technologies to prevent serious injury or harm when the grid goes down and the power goes out. So in some cases, an elevator can be considered a home medical device if you are living with a disability in a high-rise building and you need to safely get in and out of your building. I'm excited to even offer coming back in the summer of 2024 to present the results of that study. We're also engaged in energy efficiency work, and I will speak about a recent project that we worked on a bit later. We've increased our policy and regulatory efforts, as it was so critical to do so during the pandemic, which revealed so many disparities. Our funding sources come from the Add a Dollar program, which was established in 1984. That is a checkoff on your electric or gas bills, and you can add $1, $5, or more. In 2015, we received by law a portion of the system's benefit charge, which is a surcharge on electric gas bills. We received $2.1 million from that fund annually. And in 2020, we were identified to receive 10% of PURA fines in perpetuity, and the rest of our resources come from donors, foundations, and the religious community. So I really can't talk about Operation Fuel without talking about this season, which was just incredibly demanding and really a demonstration of what it means to come out of an economic shutdown as we experienced with COVID-19. So our program, we allow folks who are at 75% of state median income to apply for our program. For a household of 4, that is roughly around $94,000 annually. We provide a $500 one-time grant, and we pay the bills directly from our office. We pay the vendor, the customer's vendor of choice, or their utility company. In the summer and fall season, which starts in July and ends at the end of October, we typically serve around 1,900 households. But this year, we doubled that, and we served nearly 4,000 households. And in a winter spring, our season begins in December and typically will run through the end of May. Unfortunately, we had to shut our program down much earlier in April due to the overwhelming demand. Our program was oversubscribed, and it was just too much for us to handle. So we're totaling over 10,000 households in one program season, where typically we don't exceed serving 8,000 households. So it was definitely a banner year for us, but it was also a demonstration of all of these things, a perfect storm happening at the same time against people who are struggling with the cost of energy. So we're talking geopolitics. The war in Ukraine had an impact on natural gas prices. Electric rates doubled on January 1st. Customers are still trying to catch up with income loss as a result of the economic shutdown, and the rate of inflation compared to one's salary, they're just not lining up. So all of these things happened at the same time, and we definitely saw the impacts of that. And yeah, it was a tough year. So when there is no home energy, the elderly and children suffer the most. Children can't focus on school. They are often deprived of proper nutrition. And if you're struggling with heat, you're very likely struggling with food insecurity. This can also result in unnecessary trips to the emergency room. I just want to share a really quick story with you all. A friend of mine shared that her mom, who was a single mom, used to boil water when they didn't have enough money to pay for the heating bill, would boil water to make several trips from the kitchen to the bathroom so she could give her daughter, give her a bath. And in one of those trips, she dropped the boiling water on her feet, which landed her in the emergency room, which cost her the ability to work, costing her to fall behind on bills. So they were already vulnerable as a result of poverty, but now they were set back even further, as my friend shared that she missed many days of work. Her mom is, and she missed many days of school because her mother was her transportation to school. So one crisis can lead to another crisis, leading to another crisis, leading to another crisis. And it's really tough to come back from a crisis like that when you're already vulnerable and struggling with just the cost of housing, the cost of food, and the cost of energy. So programs like Operation Fuel are critical. However, it's not sustainable. Energy assistance is an emergency solution that can help someone in a moment, but it's not a long-term solution. Our grant is a one-time $500 grant, and it can only be accessed once a year. So if you're faced with an energy burden of 6% or more, our grant will not necessarily solve your problem. It'll help get you through the month. Our mission is necessary, but it's just not sustainable for the user. So this is Seaview Village in Bridgeport, in which our Better Homes and Building program I spoke about earlier, where we remediate health and safety barriers to allow for weatherization. We also install heat pumps. This project was completed, well, actually it began in 2008. The first phase of the project was finished around that time, and the last phase of this project was finished in 2020. So brand new housing. We received a request from DEEP to contact a resident who had nowhere to go as a result of an HVAC system that had failed, her and 11 other residents. So they were living without heat and hot water for months. And mind you, I got the call from DEEP in January. DEEP is the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Turns out one of the vendors installed Russian-made heat pumps, and they all failed, causing serious health issues. And not only were they without heat and hot water, but their health was at risk. And here are some very nasty photos. I apologize for the quality of them. But the photo on the far left is a picture of the floor where the units were leaking water, causing mold. There was rust, just a lot of awful issues there. So phase 3 of this project, as I noted earlier, was completed in 2020. The developer installed Russian-made heat pumps that were connected to ground source wells. Many of these heat pumps were reported as having serious problems with rust, standing water, mold, and of course, failed. Residents were reporting very high electric bills, which is not supposed to happen when you have a ground source heat pump. It's supposed to reduce your energy burden. And some folks had either inadequate heat or no heat at all. So when we got the call in January, I reached out to my team. We have an energy efficiency manager. Her name is Nock. She and our energy programs director, Kenya Van Eyken, made a trip down to Bridgeport, met with the residents, took a tour. We were able to link them up with an HVAC vendor. And with the help of a grant from PSEG, totaling $115,000, we were able to install brand new working American-made systems. And we matched the cost of the project with our unrestricted funds at $110,000, roughly around $110,000. And I was very proud of the work that the team did to not only respond to this issue, but the letters that we received from some of the residents will break your heart. You know, we were able to help them not only stay safe and healthy in their homes, but they were also allowed to take showers now and have heat. So with very little to no red tape, that is the power of unrestricted funds for a nonprofit like Operation Fuel, where we can meet the customer's crisis head on and in a manner that is, not making folks wait a long time to get served. So I'm very proud of that project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about energy affordability, which is a national and local crisis. So economist Roger Colton in 2003 introduced a model that calculated the dollar amount of which actual bills exceeded what is affordable. And he calls it the energy affordability gap. And out of that model, he notes that no household should pay any more than 6% of their annual income on home energy. Any amount above the 6% means that your bills are unaffordable. So similar to how home affordability is calculated as a home and shelter cost, not exceeding 30% of one's income, it's the same sort of model. However, where that study put Operation Fuel on the map, and it actually quantified the energy affordability problem in Connecticut, and a lot of people began to cite the study. I believe that the study limited our political action as energy advocates because it only focused on one's income, and it only focused on those who were severely poor, people who were at 200% of the federal poverty level. That doesn't account for the working poor, which is why our program was established in the first place. So what that did is that study didn't take into account the role that energy policy and the legacy of systemic racism has played in informing energy and regulatory policy. And we didn't engage in the regulation process as a result, because we had this study and we thought that, this was all that we needed to advance our mission. But I'm proud to note that there's a new generation of leaders in the sector who are reflecting on energy burden and its connection to the environment and connecting it to climate action. I highly recommend, if I had more time, I would work to show you this 6-minute video. Dr. Destenie Nock, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon, notes that energy uses is the inequity that we should be focusing on, and that can't be found with solely an income-based measure. So in this video, she quickly outlines the multiple forms of energy poverty, where she notes that being energy poor normally represents a lack of access to modern energy services, whereas energy insecure might mean that you have access to those services, but you are insecure in your ability to maintain access. So energy poor represents a lack of access to modern energy services. That connects me back to what I shared earlier in our work with the Green Bank, studying home medical devices and climate smart technologies. And that energy poor piece represents a lack of access to a modern grid that will help keep the power on consistently for people who are living in distressed communities. Whereas energy insecure might mean that you have access to those services, but you are insecure in your ability to maintain, and that is where the energy assistance portion comes in, or a discounted utility rate plus clean tech that can come in to reduce your energy burden. So something like a heat pump or a ground source heat pump. So when you get a chance, please Google Dr. Destenie Nock. Check out this video, very easy to find. Trying to advance here. There we go. So this is Shalonda Baker. She is the author of Revolutionary Power. She's also Deputy Director at the U.S. Department of Energy. And she notes that energy justice specifically focuses on the ways communities should have a say in shaping their energy futures through policy involvement, as well as ensuring that policies that we're developing, particularly in this moment of energy transition, don't have an unequitable impact on the most marginalized communities. You'd be surprised how clean energy can actually cause harm to distressed or marginalized communities. So it's a bit of a struggle, but she's definitely someone that you should learn more about and pick up her book. It's a great read. Unfortunately, energy policy has worked in tandem with racist systems of the past, the most significant being redlining, as I alluded to earlier, which forced Black and Latino communities into under-resourced, environmentally toxic corridors faced with high energy burdens and with a poor economic outlook. So similar to what Dr. Martin Luther King did with civil rights and linking it to economic and housing injustice, Baker makes the connection between the civil, economic, and health justice movements, noting that the energy system is at the center of each movement. So in chapter 1, Baker notes that the energy transition provides an opening to change destiny. Given the profound ways the system interacts with poor people, low to moderate income people, and people of color, this imperative to remake the energy system in an image of equity and justice is no different from the freedom struggles in the mid-20th century. The struggle for energy justice, for revolutionary power, is about nothing less than freedom. She goes on to note that the energy system itself represents the sum total of a series of political and economic choices that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of utility companies and their investors, often at the expense of utility customers, all ratepayers. Again, I highly recommend this book as it outlines how Hawaii engaged in a performance-based regulation model. Proud to say that Connecticut is the second state in the nation to also move towards a performance-based regulation model. The Take Back Our Grid Act in September of 2020 was the genesis of performance-based regulation model. And some of the elements of the Take Back Our Grid Act include justice for ratepayers, where they're holding utility companies legally responsible for compensation to consumers if the power is out for a certain amount of time and people lose food and medicine. Storm preparedness, which reforms the utility companies to do better to handle severe weather, which requires minimum in-state staffing of online workers to restore power after outages, and mandates burying power lines where possible. And the third component of the act notes that customers are preferred over the shareholders, and that it curbs excessive profits among corporate utility companies. So I see that it's about 6:43 on my end. So I'll pause there. I'll stop sharing. I'll make sure that folks have access to the slides, but I want to leave time for questions. And yeah, I'll hand it over back to Sarah.
Thank you, Brenda. And there was so much that you were saying that I was trying to write down notes. Your resources sound fantastic. I look forward to looking into those. And you had said something earlier tonight about, and it really rang true in my life when we're trying to look at a climate resiliency plan, and you said we can't achieve our climate goals without helping those that need the resources the most. And wholeheartedly agree with that. We don't need a small handful of people doing something perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. And we have to be able to get people those resources that they need so that we're all doing this. So I'm gonna see if anybody in the audience has any questions. Please, again, use the chat or the Q&A function. And I'll let people, if they have anything, write in. But Brenda, in your mind, what are the most pressing issues facing lower income communities of color in Fairfield County?
The first thing is the acknowledgement that there are lower income residents in Fairfield County. I think that there's this image of, first of all, Connecticut, there's this image of everybody driving around in Volvos and that, poverty doesn't exist, but it does exist in every corner of our state, from Litchfield County to Fairfield through Tolland. It's everywhere. Poverty is everywhere. And it's a layered issue for people because poverty is also regional, and that maybe in the northern tier of the state, the issue is more focused on a lack of public transportation or a lack of equitable broadband. So in Greenwich or lower Fairfield County, I think we need more people to acknowledge the fact that they are struggling, and that we need to push local governments as well as state and federal to ramp up services for people so that they can weatherize their homes. Energy efficiency is one of the best ways to reduce your energy burden. DEEP has an open RFP right now for health and safety remediation. The program is funded at $12 million. It's similar to our Better Homes and Buildings program, but ours is on a much smaller scale, of course. So that's the start. It's a good start, and I think it's going to be good for people to be able to get into that weatherization pipeline, access the benefits of energy efficiency, and reduce their energy burden. But we also need to acknowledge the fact that we really need to also ensure that these folks, low and moderate income ratepayers, because they're still ratepayers, despite their incomes, they're still paying their bills. They might not be paying them on time or in full every month, but they're still ratepayers who are paying into a system that benefits everybody. We need to prioritize those households to ensure that they have access to clean, renewable energy products to further reduce their energy burden. And as I shared earlier, it's very likely that low and moderate income households are living a greener lifestyle because they have access to fewer resources. They're not traveling as much, which means they're not flying. They're not, overspending on just unnecessary products and goods. In fact, very often, I grew up moderate income, working class family, and we recycled everything. We repurposed everything. The milk jug became the water jug, and then became the Kool-Aid jug, and and it got to bendy, then we cut it open and it was a shovel for mud and things like that. So I would say it's time for communities to acknowledge that they have poverty in their towns, and we need to ensure that those folks are not left behind in the energy transition.
That's great, Brenda. Thank you. So one of our conservation department's big purposes in the town of Greenwich is education and outreach. So how can we address issues of energy inequality or inequity through education and outreach?
Well, there are organizations who are the boots on the ground that have trust in the community that you can rely on to help get the word out. In Bridgeport, we work closely with the Greater Bridgeport Community Enterprises, which is a recycling program. They recycle mattresses. One of only 2 organizations that do that in the entire state. And all of the gentlemen that work in a warehouse, about 20 or 30 of them, they're all second chance individuals, meaning they've returned home from incarceration, and are actively working in the fight against climate change by recycling mattresses. And they're also a good resource to not only educate gentlemen in a warehouse, but then those guys go home and then they talk to their families. So that's one example. So nonprofits that are on the ground, the libraries are an amazing resource for information collecting and disseminating. Another quick story, the library is how I got into college. That was one of the safest spaces for me as a young adult. And the librarians there helped me identify colleges that I could easily get into. And oh man, the libraries are the best. They're safe space. So
I echo that. We're so grateful and thankful for Greenwich Library to be such a wonderful conservation partner for sure. They are.
I was actually thinking it would be great if the libraries, I can't think of it now, but I was like, gosh, it would be great if the libraries rented. It was something that was related to clean energy, and I can't remember what it was, but it would be this is kind of pie in the sky thinking, very pie in the sky thinking, renting an electric vehicle,
Right?
like loaning it out, I wouldn't know the logistics of that. But anything is possible. And that's just an idea. So
That's so, I expect to see, if anybody's going to do it, Brenda, you could probably figure that out, right? I love that. So I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about access to renewable energy sources. And something that we've heard people speaking about is making renewable energy more accessible to lower income groups, because they become a target group that instead of adding accessibility, it adds a new burden to them. So when it comes to making clean energy, solar, wind, hydro more accessible, how do you focus on making it accessible rather than burdening lower income groups with the task of, quote unquote, fixing the problem?
Well, we've actually been surveying our service population over the last year. Trying to understand what their barriers are to adopting clean energy products and accessing programs. The main barrier is a lack of understanding of the products and programs, how to get involved or how to engage, and of course, the upfront costs. So installing a heat pump can cost anywhere between $4,000 to $8,000, depending on what the situation is in a home. For an everyday consumer, that's a lot of money. And we need to figure out a way to, I know that folks don't like the word socialism, but in the same way that the country socialized the building of the middle class post World War II, allowing for former military to get a free education, get into their first home, all of that was how we really built up the infrastructure in this country. So now that we're in this energy revolution, that's how we should really be thinking about this. We should be thinking about this in a way that, you're going to have your higher income earners who can adopt these tools and are already doing so, have been for the last 20, 30 years. And, they can do that. But we also have to ensure that people who are at the bottom are able to adopt as well. And if we're ever going to achieve our goals and decarbonize, we really have to start with our most vulnerable. We have to decarbonize these cities. Connecticut has the oldest housing stock in the country, and a lot of our homes were built before the 60s, and they're not going to be torn down to build new ones. So it's really time to focus on those homes. So it really is about outreach and education, awareness building. And I wish that there were a way in which we can house all of these programs under one umbrella, so that you went to a website and you just checked on the box of all what your needs and wants were. And then the information popped back to you helping you figure out how to get to them. So yeah, I think we really need to use technology in a way that makes us more efficient.
And speaking of technology, do you see any emerging energy solutions that are exciting to you?
There is one, it's really quite funny. So there are toilets that can actually help you identify your vitamin levels. So I'm talking about like increasing one's access to health information is critically important. Um, yeah, I know you didn't ask me this question, but I did want to bring this up. I'm a huge fan of HGTV, and I watched this show called Rock the Block. I just binge watch it. I love it so much. But these folks who I really love, these TV hosts, they're purchasing $16,000 gas stoves to install in these new homes that are very likely energy efficient.
Mhm.
And they're installing these $16,000 stoves. I actually replaced our gas stove with an electric stove, and my breathing has improved significantly. I didn't realize that until it was removed. Um, so I wish that in addition to the toilet, that television is one of those medians that could really make an impact. And HGTV needs to follow more like this old house and focus on energy efficiency. So I'm not so excited about what HGTV is doing in terms of the products that they're purchasing, but I did want to just put that out there.
That's a really good point, Brenda. There was a earlier in 2023, there's a lot of news around the recent studies around gas stoves and as technology gets better and energy efficiency gets better, it's all related to health and well-beings, right? And that's what you're trying to illustrate to us, to show us. And
And my point about social media, what did that TV host do? May he rest in peace. He claimed that, the far left is trying to radicalize gas stoves, and he called them racist. It's like,
yeah,
and that is the power of television. So yeah.
I know we'll look back on one day and go, remember when we all, we all had gas stoves and how terrible they were, but
Right,
we're,
right.
we're getting there. We're getting there. But
Yep.
well, it's getting pretty close. I might have one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
You focused on, tonight's conversation was on environmental justice and energy equity, but can you maybe just close out about other forms of environmental inequities that you know of?
I think the biggest one is, I hate to say this, but utilities have had their way with policy and the regulatory making process for a very long time in states like Ohio and Florida. Companies have engaged in bribing leaders and local legislatures, waged war against people running for office who base their campaigns on energy reform. I mean, when you look at a state like Florida, every home should have solar panels. It's the sunshine state.
Yeah.
But utility companies have used local media to influence positive articles about their efforts to restore power, and have even hired community activists to lie and spread false information about the rate making process. So I think PURA allows for public participation. However, as a lone advocate or an everyday citizen, it takes time and resources to engage in the docketed process. Right now, making its way through the legislature, I'm hoping it passes. SB 7 is a huge energy bill. A component of that bill allows for everyday consumers to engage in the PURA process, and get reimbursed. Excuse me. Right now, there are only 3 organizations that I can think of that fully engage in that process to push back on some harmful practices that utility companies have sometimes do. And that's the Center for Children's Advocacy, Connecticut Legal Services, and Operation Fuel. You know, we were lucky enough to hire a policy director 3 years ago who has really dug in, and she's done an excellent job in following these dockets and getting engaged at the in Hartford at the Capitol. So yeah, I think it's really important for organizations that are on the ground to have resources that allow for us to compete, to hire talent so that we can engage and be the voice of consumers, everyday consumers who just don't have the time, the energy, or the understanding. Energy policy is very complicated. A lot of it I don't even understand still. I've been doing this work for 13 years. So yeah, I'd like to just note that it's important to support organizations that can get engaged in the work.
Well, Brenda, thank you so much for providing such an insightful and important discussion on environmental justice and energy equity. We would absolutely love to have you back later in the year to talk about your report findings. Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. We were grateful that you were able to share your evening with us. Special thanks to Laura Matthews with the library and for hosting Zoom, the Greenwich Library, and our Conservation Commission staff, Snehal Matre and Rebecca Poirier, for all your work coordinating this webinar. Everyone who signed up for this webinar will receive a follow-up email with the recording and additional websites additional links to educational resources pertaining to environmental justice. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for having me. This has been very humbling. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda.
Good night.